Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, I'm Father Mitch Pack, and welcome to EWTN Live. We bring you guests from around the world. Our guest tonight is here to help us look at the bigger picture of medical ethics, and to do so in light of incredible technological and scientific advancements in medicine, especially in the area of gender issues and of infertility. He's the author of a new book entitled Transplanting the Womb, a Catholic bioethical analysis. So please welcome our guest, Dr. Andrew S. Kubick. Andrew, welcome. Good to have you here with us.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And you are teaching right now, correct?
I am, yes.
Yeah. What level?
So I teach at the high school level. I teach at a Catholic high school in Northern Virginia. And one of our claims to fame, one of them, is we have a 4-year bioethics program. 4-year bioethics program for high school students, starting in 9th grade all the way to 12th. And I also teach at the University of Mary, where I teach in their graduate program. I teach bioethical issues to most of my students are already out in the field, so working professionals who are going back for a Master's of Science degree in bioethics.
Nice. And one of the things we should do for our audience, what is bioethics? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a very common question. It's a good question. So bioethics, if we look at the term, we can divide it up into bio and we can look at it ethics. So the two aspects to the term. So what we study with bioethics is how we determine good conduct in the biological sciences, whether it's medicine, whether it's scientific research. So bio, the biological aspects, and then ethics, the good conduct. And it's really, I like to tell people that a Catholic bioethicist, our motto is a Bible verse from St. Paul, where he talks to the Thessalonians and he says, test everything, hold fast to what is true and good, and avoid what is evil. That's what the job of a bioethicist is.
Yeah.
To analyze and to try to determine what is good so that people can do it and, God willing, flourish, and what is evil and avoid it.
Now, some problems of bioethics have been around for a long time, and people had to deal with a variety of questions of how to treat, especially other humans, but also it applies to ethical treatment of animals. You know, you can't be cruel to animals. It's legitimate to use them in food and such and clothing, but it's not ethical to be cruel. This is fairly set out there, and humans have considered that for millennia.
Correct.
Yes. That's pretty old. But you are taking on a lot of new areas. What is making things so active? Why are there so many new controversies?
Sure. So first off, I don't think technology necessarily has to move in a very steady fashion. What we do is we find technology increasing almost at a breakneck speed, where it's building one upon another upon another. We see this, for example, in artificial intelligence.
Yes.
When years ago we weren't talking much about it other than in the movies, and now we're having questions, very deep, profound questions about to what extent, if at all, artificial intelligence could even replace a human. And so I think that when it comes to technology, it moves rapidly. And it's the job of ethicists, moral theologians, it's the gifts of the church to apply millennial old teaching, going back to sacred scripture, the teachings of the church fathers. The 20th century, we have such a rich deposit of work from the holy fathers of the 20th century, and applying that to the technology as we see it moving today. Now, with regard to another reason why it's moving so quickly is I think that we continue to lose sight of what it means to be human and what it means to value human life. I don't think that's something new, but we're going further and further and further down what Pope St. John Paul II called the culture of death, where we're losing sight of the value of human life. And once we lose sight of that, it almost seems like anything is permissible.
In fact, one other source that you didn't mention, but I know you use, is the ancient philosophy. there are a lot of very ancient philosophers who also were dealing with the, what is the basis for truth and the existence and such. I'm thinking especially of Aristotle, who wrote about ethics. He wrote a book called The Ethics. And, but there's also very important ethical reflections from Plato and a number of others. But I think probably Aristotle is the one who's most applicable to biology.
Well, I don't think we have to look very far to see why St. Thomas Aquinas called Aristotle the philosopher in his writing. He recognized so much truth, not exclusively truth or not completely the truth. Aristotle certainly had his flaws and errors, but he provided so much with regard to our understanding, not only, as you mentioned, of ethics. He actually wrote 3 books on ethics, but also on our understanding of science, on our understanding of form and matter, our understanding of the nature of things. So he was critically important.
Yeah, and we can't emphasize enough how important it is to look to that basic philosophy in Aristotle, so we do understand the nature of reality. That's one of the difficulties. In terms of how we deal with these ethical questions.
It is. One of the dilemmas that students, whether it's at the high school or even at the college level, one of the dilemmas that they face, one of the challenges as being a part of the culture we live in today, is the culture constantly impresses upon people that there is no such thing as a nature of something or even of someone, but also if there is a nature, if there is such a thing, it's whatever you define it to be. And so everything is malleable, everything is transferable, everything is really whatever someone wants. It's John Paul II called it the radical capacity to autonomy. He called it a perverse notion of autonomy or freedom. And that's what we're seeing today, where people are exercising license rather than freedom and just calling whatever they want good to be good.
And one of the points that I find very interesting is that while on one hand, perhaps some would even say, on one side of their mouth, they will say, I am completely free to define myself and my reality, and that I'm completely autonomous. I do as I wish, and such. But if you go against the decisions they have made and have your other truth, they will stifle. As a matter of fact, some of these people are starting to make the Spanish Inquisition look good. That they don't tolerate you disagreeing with them. And that's one of the great ironies of this, too.
It seems to completely fly in the face of what we known as classical liberalism, where it was a convergence of ideas, of philosophies, where we would challenge one another. We would present what we think is the truth, where we could push back on it and get into disagreements and fraternal exchanges. But you're right, now we live in a culture that it seems as if we aren't willing to engage, or if we do engage, we might get really almost a form of white martyrdom, where we're losing relationships, we're losing promotions, professional opportunities, maybe even family and friends. There's so much at stake, but I think the reason we do what we do and the reason why we say what we say and share what we share in the Catholic Church is out of love. And when we share the truth, not my truth, the truth, when we share that, when we do it in love, we're willing to make those sacrifices because we truly believe what we have to offer is going to help someone, going to help them flourish.
Yeah. Now, specifically in your book, and I think you've written this book about the issue of transplanting wombs, so a uterus,
Yes.
from a woman into either another woman or even into a man, correct?
So the first one, absolutely. They have been, right now, over 100 uteri have been transplanted into a woman. Regarding the latter of the two, with regard to men, we have no instances in which a uterus was transplanted into a man, although there is a lot of talk about the possibility, and perhaps even the possibility in the near future.
And this is something that would have, again, been considered science fiction in the past, but this is something that is becoming possible. And you are critical of this. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. How long's the show again? So I think first, regarding how quickly this has moved upon us. So we believe, and it isn't written so much in the medical literature, but there are rumors and there are more popular essays and accounts listed of the first uterus transplant into a human being actually took place, I believe it was in the 1930s, into a male actor. So actually the first one, and again, I don't talk about this much because I like to lean on the medical and scientific literature, but there does seem to be evidence to support that the first uterus transplantation ever into a human being occurred with a man back in the 30s. And the accounts say that it was upon that surgery that this actor tragically died, this gentleman tragically died. Now, flash forward, the first attempt that we see in the what we call the clinical trials, where everything was done and the animal research and having all the professionals gather and developing the strategy, et cetera, in a medical setting, happened in 2000 in Saudi Arabia. There was one. And then another one happened in 2011 in Turkey, again, one. And then in 2012, 13, and 14 in Sweden was really the first success. And success, according to uterine transplantation, is not the safe reception of a uterus, and that's part of it. It's not necessarily even the establishment of a pregnancy, that's part of it. But really, success within the field of uterus transplantation is measured by live births. And so it's the Swedish trial in which 9 women received a uterus, 7 of them were maintained, 2 had to be removed. And after that, we've had, some reports are saying 4, some are even saying 6 children born from those uteri, going back over 10 years now. Continue to flash forward, other countries, and even within the United States, we have university hospital systems or standalone clinics who are performing this. Baylor University Medical Center down in Texas is the global leader right now in uterus transplantation. Altogether, over 100 uteri have been transplanted, and reports are approximately 70 children have been born from these uteri. You asked the question, why am I critical of it? Well, the first aspect to becoming a candidate for a uterus transplant, the first one, and this is mandatory, is that a woman would undergo IVF, in vitro fertilization, and have a number of embryos, human embryos, frozen, cryopreserved, so that if this woman would receive a uterus, once the stability of that uterus is established, then they would start transferring an embryo or embryos to try to bring about that pregnancy. So with this technology, my book could have been much shorter, to be quite honest with you, simply because the requirements of in vitro fertilization to receive a womb. Now, with some of the book and moving forward, I did speculate, well, what are some other opportunities? What are some other options in order to establish that pregnancy? And we can get into that if you'd like, but going back to in vitro fertilization, the fact that it was a requirement and continues to be a requirement tells me, and actually the church tells us, is probably a better way to say it, the church tells us that this is something that we cannot participate in.
What is the moral problem with in vitro fertilization? We've recently seen the President Trump, trying to get legislation and move this along. Many Christians, and they are very pro-life. They want children. They're against abortion and such. And they were cheering this on. No, there's nothing that they could see wrong with in vitro fertilization, where a child is conceived outside the womb, and there's an embryo, and then that's transplanted into a woman. What is the moral problem that we see with it?
Sure, certainly. And you actually shared some of it right there. When it comes to in vitro fertilization, when it comes to the creation of human life, by a technician really, outside of a mother's uterus, in a petri dish, that's where we actually get the term in vitro.
Yeah, vitro is the word for glass.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. We really see, I think, fundamentally two moral issues right away. And that is the separation of husband and wife from one another, because the way in which in vitro fertilization comes about is husband and wife do not engage in the conjugal act. They're actually separated. The woman receives hormones to mature as many what we call oocytes or immature eggs in her ovaries as possible. And I was just looking at the numbers earlier today. I mean, averaging between 10, 17 maybe eggs will be extracted from the woman. And then the husband, he'll have his gametes, his sperm procured by himself, and we all know what that means. And so rather than coming together in the two-person, one-flesh union, in this loving act of giving of oneself, receiving the other, this beautiful conjugal act, and the openness, the docility to God for whether or not a human being will actually be engendered. We're seeing that man and all of the technology is coming together to take these gametes, egg and sperm, and to put them in a petri dish and to create human life, not as the gift received, but as a really tragically, and I don't like speaking about this because it is a human being, but it's almost, this embryonic child is almost seen as a product to be manufactured. When he or she, even at that earliest stage, really, we used to say fertilization, we used to say conception, now we say sperm egg fusion. I mean, we go to the earliest point in which this is now a new entity of the human species. At that point, that is a child of God who is loved and who ought to be respected and who ought to be received as a gift. And so we see the separation of spouses and we see the manufacture of human life. And right there, that is incredibly morally problematic.
Do some people say, well, you just have an old-fashioned view, and you know, this is like opposing Galileo all over again? And the people who say that kind of thing. Is that what the issue is? We just don't want to deal with progress? Or is there something more about integrity of human life?
Well, I think the presumption with the Galileo analogy, or with that notion that we're against progress, it almost presumes the fact that all progress is good. In this case, by separating the spouses and by creating human life outside of the natural act, we're getting further and further away from the dignity of spouses and the dignity of the human being. And call me old-fashioned or call the church antiquated, but we recognize in every human being, even the ones who disagree with me on this issue, an equality of dignity, an absolute value of person, and that goes from the embryonic stage of human life all the way up to the natural passing of a human being. The Catholic Church's teaching on the dignity of human life transcends politics, because we all know how volatile politics are right now. It transcends culture, it transcends language barrier, color of skin, it transcends all of that. We are one human family. But again, that human family begins at the beginning of life, at sperm egg fusion. And so I don't think the Catholic Church is against progress. I think the Catholic Church is guarded because she does not want to see human life devalued, and seeing human life as simply something that could be manipulated and can be the subject of technological advancements. Human life has to always be regarded as noble.
Yes. I think that's a very important element. And involved in this, especially since there's not the normal relationship between a husband and wife, human life is also relational and not mechanical. You know, this is another important aspect. And I think even people who would call themselves very progressive also have a lot of concerns about developments of science if they see that it has a bad impact, for instance, on the environment.
Sure.
If they see that progress is going forward, but if it pollutes the environment and causes cancer, death of animal species, etc., degrades the environment, they would be against it because they value the dignity of the environment.
Yeah.
We're also applying that in this case to valuing the dignity of the love between a husband and wife.
That's right.
And the integral values of a child.
Absolutely. Everyone who comes to a moral dilemma applies a moral philosophy, whether they want to admit it or not. Even looking at one of the most common, especially in the secular parts of the discussion, we see a philosophy called utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham.
Yes.
But they even admit it, it's a moral philosophy. Everyone's coming to the table with different ways of viewing the world, different ways of viewing the problem, and also different values that they assign to different things. We come with a moral philosophy that is as old as the beginning of time. And as you mentioned a little bit earlier, that rests on the Greeks, rests on Jewish philosophers, rests on centuries of moral theologians. One person who I just love looking at because it helps me understand the scope of the Catholic moral philosophy is someone by the name of Archbishop Daniel Cronin. Archbishop Daniel Cronin wrote a book called Ordinary and Extraordinary Means of Conserving Life. It's a book to help people understand what their moral obligations are with medical decisions, such as when is it morally permissible to discontinue a ventilator and in what circumstance, or a feeding tube, etc. His doctoral dissertation and then book under that name studied 5 centuries worth of moral theologians, 48 different moral theologians. I think he spoke 5, 6 different languages in order to do the research, and I know you're a little bit past that, but he spoke a number of languages to read the original texts. That is, I think, a very timely example of the scope of the study and the scope of which the moral theologians we stand on in order to help better understand and to apply these centuries, millennia old principles to try to determine good conduct.
Yeah. And there are, in addition to these initial problems, there are other temptations that come with these transplants. For instance, we mentioned the talk, at least at this stage, not that there's any known action, of implanting a uterus in a male, and with the idea that they could have a child. You told me about a researcher discussing this with a husband and wife.
Yes.
And why did they want to put transplant a uterus into the husband?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I think when people consider what you just said, when people consider the possibility of a uterus being surgically transplanted into a man, given the culture we live in today and the last decade especially, people will automatically consider this to be someone with gender dysphoria, a man who identifies as a female but is a man. And so their thoughts immediately go to that. But you bring up a scenario that I mentioned to you, and it was one that I will admit stunned me. As I was researching this book, and before this book was the doctoral dissertation, I mean, there were a lot of things that really shocked me, and this was one. And so this physician scientist both an OBGYN as well as a researcher, and that's why I call him a physician scientist. He's really doing both. He was really the father of uterus transplantation. He was the leader, for example, in that Swedish study I talked about. He was doing a TED Talk, a TEDx talk, and he told the crowd he was speaking to, he said that he received an email from a husband and wife, and they were inquiring about the possibility of receiving a transplanted womb. And he responded back, and he was asking some questions, some preliminary questions, and many of the questions were directed towards the woman, such as, for example, were you born without a uterus, what we call a congenital abnormality, or did you have your uterus removed, a therapeutic hysterectomy, maybe to remove a cancer, for example. And the response he got back drew the applause of the audience at that TEDx talk. The response he got back was, this couple viewed justice as the woman will carry the first pregnancy and the husband will carry the second. And so that was one that I did not see coming, but two things shocked me. Number one, just the proposal, and then number two, the round of applause that received. It was almost widely received, at least amongst that audience.
And her other line that, well, that'll be, I'll have my baby and he'll have his baby. When you described that discussion, I thought, my parents talked about our babies, not my baby or your baby. Well, okay, when I misbehaved, I belonged to the other parent.
Sure.
But maybe that was more often than I thought. But be that as it may, but it was our children, and this technological possibility gets them to think that's your baby, this is my baby.
Well, it certainly begs the question of whose pregnancy is it? Like, this is my pregnancy, the next one will be yours. And they can really, sadly, I think there's a lot that can be said going from that in terms of parsing out, this is your responsibility, this is yours. Not to get too in depth in this one, but we see something very similar in terms of crossing the line of the complementarity of sexes, blurring that line. And that's where we already have evidence to show that a male has received such a profound and targeted hormone regimen over the course of time that we actually have now cases in which males are exclusively nursing children. And so there's a blurring, I think, of the responsibilities and the duties, which stand on top of blurring really the complementarity of sexes that God intended from the beginning when he made us male and female.
And again, that again goes to that relationship and the integrity of a relationship that is mutual.
Yes.
But it's, as you say, they complement the differences, work together, and give different aspects. Husbands and wives do take somewhat different roles, even in the nurturing of children over years. Dads are more likely to roughhouse with their kids, and moms are more likely to read them stories and talk to them and all that. And dads tend to drive moms crazy by tossing babies in the air and catching them.
Yes.
But there are differences that teach different aspects of life to the child, and that is rather seen of what is fair by an abstract notion rather than deal with physical reality as it is.
Yeah, God's design that the church has recognized and that the church teaches is the importance of having that maleness and the femaleness in the household, the fatherhood and the motherhood in the household. Yeah. Now, there are some circumstances, tragically, where perhaps one of the spouses is not present in the house, and the other spouse who is present is I'm sure, doing their best in order to try to serve. But where we find really God's design fulfilled is where we have that husband and wife in the household, because as you mentioned, I think you're absolutely correct, each play a critical role in the development of the children.
Yes. And I don't think at all that it's an accident that when the couple is not married, and usually that means one parent raises the child and the other is usually absent, which is now the majority of our children. 52% of children are being raised to unmarried parents, usually single parents. And this is a factor that includes a sense of abandonment by the child of the missing parent. And it's also strongly linked to a series of other problems, including conviction and imprisonment. 85% of inmates have that experience that they're from unmarried parents, and that sense of abandonment is very strong. That speaks from the negative side, the absence, to the really high importance of making that commitment to your spouse and to the children the two of you bring together, a lifelong commitment. Because unlike calves, kids take a long time to walk and even longer time to potty train. It's easier to train a dog. You know, they just take longer. But they're worth every bit of it.
Sure. Yes, they certainly are.
We have to take a break. We'll come back in just a minute. We're with Dr. Andrew Kubick, and we will continue discussing some of these important issues and getting your questions, so please stay with us. Welcome back. We are discussing a book called Transplanting the Womb, a Catholic bioethical analysis. It's by our guest, Andrew S. Kubick, and you can get a copy of this at our religious catalog. You go to EWTNRC.com, and this book is item number 72779. 72779. And again, get it at EWTNRC.com. It's a good topic because it helps us to think about other bioethical questions as well. And there are plenty of them in our modern world. Are you ready for some questions?
Absolutely.
Well, let's start off. Sir, where are you from?
Pleasant Grove, Alabama.
Good to have you here. Welcome. And your question?
If a woman transplants her uterus and then another woman transplants her embryo, what would be the genetic marker? Would it be the original owner of embryo, the original owner of the uterus, or the person carrying them?
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Great question.
Excellent. Excellent.
Great question. Actually, right away, it makes me think of one of the articles that came from that Swedish trial that we talked about, that first real successful one. And the title of the article was One Uterus Bridging 3 Generations. And it was a mother who donated her uterus to her daughter. And then that original donor, her grandchild, was gestated in that uterus and was then born. So one uterus bridging 3 generations. That's what it really made me think of. When it comes to genes, the genetics of that human embryo, that embryonic human being, is going to be the result of the fusion of sperm and egg, of the coming together of the 23 chromosomes in the sperm and the 23 in the egg. And so the male who produced the sperm and the female who produced the egg are the ones who are going to provide the genes to that embryonic human being. The uterus is a remarkable muscle but that's precisely what it is. It's a gestational cavity. Its purpose is to allow that child to grow and to be safe and to have a wall in which nutrients can pass through it into the placenta to help feed and nurture that child. And so that's the role of the uterus. But when it comes to the genetic makeup of that embryonic human being, it would be whoever provided the sperm and whoever provided the egg.
Okay, good. So it wouldn't be there would be no markers from the womb itself, but from the genetic background of the father and the mother.
Correct.
Okay. All right, thank you. That helps. And we have another question from our studio. And sir, where are you from?
I am from Birmingham, Alabama.
Good to have you. Welcome.
Yes, thank you.
And your question?
In addition to the ethical concerns, what are the health concerns and controversies in transplanting a uterus, specifically into a person that might not normally have one, ergo a man?
It's a great question. Another great question.
Yeah.
So I'd like to start with really the risks that we know of within a recipient who's a woman. Because remember, the recipient who's a man is speculative at this point, but we have had some doctors and some physician scientists and some ethicists speculate what those risks can be. But I think it is important to emphasize the risks that a woman endures when she receives a transplanted womb. Because within the book, I talked about in vitro fertilization and that being the moral impediment. But again, I too speculated, well, what if? What if natural conception could occur? After the immorality of IVF, I couldn't get over what I think is the imprudence of pursuing the surgery itself. And I consider it imprudent because of this, and I think it answers the person's question. A woman who receives a uterus, besides one case, we only have one case, at least reported in the medical literature, of a woman who received a womb from her identical twin. And because it was her identical twin, it was a genetic match, and she didn't need a specific type of a medicine called immunosuppressant medications.
Oh, yes. Right,
and so what is an immunosuppressant medication? It's actually a really important aspect to this discussion. Immunosuppressant medication does precisely what the term suggests. It suppresses the individual's immune system so that the immune system doesn't target the uterus and attack it. The language is non-self, and it sees biological material that's non-self, and the immune system wants to attack it. Immunosuppressant medications shut that down. So there's risks with immunosuppressant medication because the person on that medication does not have a properly functioning immune system. Besides that one case of an identical twin, every recipient of a uterus transplant has to be on what we call immunosuppressant medication. So that is a serious endeavor. Then you have the actual transplantation surgery.
Just so we understand that, isn't that the case when people have other transplants, liver transplants, et cetera?
That's exactly right.
Yes.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So that is par for the course when it comes to the transplantation, unless, again, it's genetically identical. But with this, because it's a non-vital organ, there's questions raised ethically about what is the individual willing to endure. And Father, if you don't mind, I just want to say this moment, we talked about IVF, we're talking about what this individual is willing to endure. I do want to just take one moment and say, I completely understand and am incredibly compassionate and empathetic to the individuals who heroically carry the cross of infertility. The women who are seeking this procedure out really desperately want to be able to bear their own child.
Yes.
And I fully understand that. And that's why my book is actually dedicated to the women who have infertility, because I appreciate and I understand their desire, but I think it's important that we think objectively about, in this case, what we're talking about right now, the risks they're willing to endure in order to see that desire come to fruition. And so I do want to make sure I mention that. Thank you.
And so our audience also understands, you say that as a man who has a family,
Yes.
you're married and you have children,
I am.
you understand that desire for children and living that out
Yes.
from inside the experience.
Yes.
This is not
Yeah.
outside of you, but this is part of the way your whole life.
Absolutely. It's been such a remarkable part of my vocation, being a husband and father, but also as an ethicist, I work part-time at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, and through the NCBC, as we call it, I've had really the privilege to accompany couples who heroically carry that cross of infertility. So not only do I recognize the blessing it is to have children, but I've also been able to, I would say, God willing, help couples who struggle with that. And I pray that I was able to help them. So I've actually seen both sides of that. So I just wanted to make that one quick point. So
good point to make.
So we have the immunosuppressant medication, we have the transplantation surgery, then we have the embryo transfer or embryo transfers, because the goal of the uterus transplantation procedure is 2 live births. That's the goal. No woman has had more than 2 live births after that. And so immunosuppressants, transplant surgery, embryo transfer, each one of those pregnancies is defined as a high-risk pregnancy. They're routinely scrutinizing the health of the mother and the child, as they ought to be. But they're considered high-risk pregnancies. Each one of those pregnancies conclude with a cesarean section. There are no vaginal births when it comes to uterus transplantation. So there's now cesarean sections on top of that, or C-sections. And then finally, because they want to discontinue those immunosuppressants as soon as possible, these womb transplants, they always conclude with a finalizing hysterectomy, where that transplanted womb is now removed. So to answer the question, I mean, just seeing that process that woman's willing to go through to understandably want to realize what it means to bear her own child, again, understandably, I think it's very imprudent to go through all of those risks in light of the fact, for example, to have a family, we have the accessibility of adoption.
Yeah. And that does sound like a lot of risk to the mother and some risks to the child, apparently.
Well, time will tell, and I will say I pray every day. This dissertation preceding it has really moved me. I pray every day for these children, I really do. And so far, the children who have been born from this procedure have been healthy. We don't have a lot of reports coming out that there have been any abnormalities outside of what they consider to be kind of the window of abnormality when it comes to, for example, abnormalities associated with IVF, and then the general abnormalities we might see with any birth, because with every birth there comes risks, and we see more risk with IVF. So honestly, praise God that these children so far have been healthy, but we have to remember when we're talking about in vitro fertilization, one of the steps of in vitro fertilization is pre-implantation screenings. So as that embryo is growing over the course of perhaps 3 days, the doctors are going to go in and they're going to biopsy one of the cells, and they're going to do screenings to see if there's genetic or chromosomal abnormalities. And those human embryos, those embryonic human beings that are seen as abnormal, will most likely be destroyed. So as part of this process, praise God, the children who have been born are healthy. At least that's what's reported. But the IVF process is fraught with dangers for those little children, beginning already on the 3rd day of their existence, where they're being screened and graded, and if they fail, being discarded.
Yeah, and again, that's treating them again like a commodity.
That's right.
That they're not a commodity.
No.
That's what we don't want. We have another question from our studio audience. Sir, where are you from?
Vincennes, Indiana.
Good to have you. Welcome. And your question?
What are the spiritual risks of having an embryo transfer?
What are the spiritual risks?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about the spiritual side of this, I immediately think of how, with regard to spirituality, we have morality. And so I see the moral risks of this being the divorce, not the legal contractual divorce, but the divorce of husband and wife from one another, as we talked about a little bit earlier with regard to IVF. And all of the aspects of IVF that separate, even sexually, couples one from the other. I think that is, just another thing that's separating and really tearing apart the family. Additionally, we see the spiritual or moral side of things, the moral risk when it comes to questions of should these human embryos, as we just mentioned, undergo this screening, this pre-implantation screenings. The Holy Mother Church, and if I may, one of the documents which I recommend all of your audience and all of the viewers pay close attention to, there's a document from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops called the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services, or simply the ERDs. And what's
So say the title
Sure,
again, the
absolutely. Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services.
Okay, good.
And it's in its 7th edition now. We actually just got a new edition this past November. The reason I bring that up is because the bishops, as our teachers, as our shepherds, they have recognized pre-implantation screenings are inherently immoral, and we shouldn't participate in them because they're a fruit of IVF. It's an action that follows it, and it's also inherently eugenic, where we're just taking the children that do not fit, whether it's the grade or the screening apparatus, whatever they're using to grade these children, the ones seen unfit are discarded. But the bishops then follow up with, for prenatal testing. So when a woman is pregnant, when she gets tests done to make sure that her child is healthy, the bishops tell us this: as long as those tests are being done without any intention or openness to a negative result or negative prognosis of that child, would lead the mother or the couple into considering abortion. But if they're using prenatal screenings in order to try to determine if there's a congenital defect so they can prepare for that child's birth, Holy Mother Church, through her bishops, permits that. So there's a big moral distinction there between pre-implantation genetic screening and prenatal testing. And I think that's another, to the gentleman's question, another one of those spiritual risks, because one can, the more they know, be tempted. And so we have to be very clear and strong of heart, strong of will, husband and wife coupled together, shoulder to shoulder, if they receive troubling news with regard to the results of their child in utero, the child's tests, that they're willing to learn, prepare, and to welcome that child with open arms. I think that's another spiritual risk as well.
And it's, I get this from any number, over the years, a lot of women have told me how their doctor was pushing them to abort a child. The doctor saw something that he or she considered abnormal and pushed them to, and a lot of these women have said to me, going up against a mom is usually not a good idea.
No, it is not.
It's not a good idea. And these moms have taken their healthy children to the doctors and said, look at him. He just graduated college. No thanks to you. So this is, a very important thing. The couple in their relationship has to be strong in faith and commitment and love for each other and their child.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, Father. Prognoses, and I truly believe our doctors are trying to do their best, looking at the objective evidence and saying, this is what I think. But prognoses can be wrong. And we see that not only at the beginning of life, we see it at the end of life too, where we have healthcare professionals going to the families of people who are on life support saying, you should consider discontinuing this, a feeding tube or a ventilator or what have you, because they only have so long to live. Well, again, I do not want to guess the intentions of our healthcare professionals, but they're doing their best to come up with a prognosis, but it's in God's time when we're called home. And so we use that as information to help inform us, but we do not use that as information to justify immoral procedures.
Exactly. We have another question from our studio. I just want to make sure we get to this young man. Sir, where are you from?
Chanelville, Indiana.
Good to have you. Welcome. And your question?
What are the requirements for the transplanting?
Yeah, that's a good question. What are the requirements for transplanting the womb?
Okay, thank you.
Very good question. So right now, and I say right now because there are conversations that are going on right now to broaden the parameters for who qualifies. But what we know is for the donor, for example, they're looking for a woman who has had at least one pregnancy so that they know that the uterus has the ability to carry a pregnancy to term.
Okay.
So that's one, for example. And that also raises another concern that I'll just briefly say. Moral theologians, even before me, some ones who, thank God, I humbly stood on their shoulders to write this book because of their writing. They recognize the importance that if, morally speaking, a woman is going to donate her uterus, it has to be after she has completed menopause, because we are not permitted to attack a functioning system of the body unless it's necessary to save our own life. And so some of the moral theologians who I quoted in the book, and I'm grateful for their scholarship, have said that it has to be a postmenopausal, if at all. That's not a part of the conversation necessarily when it comes to who qualifies as a donor. It's has the uterus had one full-term pregnancy, and has the woman attested to the fact that she's done her childbearing journey? Is she done having children? Now, some have the parameters, some have the criteria that they have to be postmenopausal, but that's not across the board. Some just have to attest. And then in addition to those two, you'll see that they're cancer-free, that they're not, for example, a smoker, different kind of what we almost would see with a typical transplant, a typical organ or tissue that's being moved. With regard to the recipient, this is going to be interesting, I think, for you in the audience, because we wouldn't necessarily think this. But today, every single program, whether it's the program down in Baylor or whether it's the studies that are in progress, require the recipient to have at least one functioning ovary. It's kind of interesting. So if they had a hysterectomy where their uterus and their cervix, their fallopian tubes are removed, if their ovaries remained and they can still be stimulated to mature eggs, then they can be a recipient of a transplanted womb. And so there has to be at least one ovary that could be matured through hormones. And the reason for that is, to date, they do not accept donated eggs or donated embryos. They don't accept that yet. It has to be an egg from the woman who's going to receive the uterus. Okay. So that's a criteria. And then they're going to do several other type of normal screenings, biological screenings. They'll look at the age of the individual, because the age not only tells them how they're going to do with the transplanted womb, but also will tell them how many embryos they're going to transfer. Because what we do know is once we go past the 20s and 30s into the 40s, we're seeing more embryos will most likely be transferred than if a woman was, for example, 28 years old.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you've given us a tremendous amount of information, and you can look at even more of the information available in the book, Transplanting the Womb, a Catholic Bioethical Analysis by our guest, Dr. Andrew S. Kubick. It's available at ewtnrc.com, and it is item number 72779, 72779. And it's not only about this topic, but it also helps us to think through these issues of bioethics and wider perspective. We've run out of time. Thank you for coming all this way, and may the Lord bless all of you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you. May he lead you in all of your ways by his peace. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We can bring you this program or other programs about life and ethics and our faith only because this network is brought to you by you. So please remember to keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill. If you do that, we'll be able to pay all of our bills too. God bless you all, and thank you very much.